was, a little disappointed at first for a day or two when it sounded like everything was going to get canceled. And then, like everything else, it's just like, that's life now. You're disappointed by some bad development, and then you go on. And, I ended up enjoying doing a lot of these Zoom conversations. And at least if she's any judge of it, my wife was telling me that she thinks that those conversations have been more in-depth and more kind of revealing than when I'm forced to sit on a stage in front of an audience and I get kind of self-conscious. So, maybe the quality of the chats has been better. The experience might not be as fun for people to, when it's not like a social event to go to or something. But if it's just the actual, content and information, I think they've actually been better in a lot of ways.
Do you get the sense that you might have shut down even further because this is such a personal book for you?
Definitely. Yeah. I was worried about the promotion for this book. With my previous book, Killing and Dying, it felt like I just had to go out on stage and talk about other people, like these made up characters and everything. And it wasn't that introspective, at least when I was trying to talk about the book. But with this, there was going to be no escaping it. And we had a pretty extensive tour planned all across the country and some international stuff. And I really thought I was going to have that experience of living through what a lot of the book is about. And like I would go to like a poorly attended event and have to talk about my comic about going to poorly attended events or something like that. I sort of dreaded the Q&A where I sort of opened myself up to a lot of, I assumed I would be put on the spot a lot about asking about who some of the characters in the book were or what some of the scratched out names were or something like that. And I was trying to prep myself for how to handle that.
Is that rational anxiety that you have as far as these kind of sparsely attended shows? Is that just something that never goes away when you're a cartoonist at a certain level?
I've heard from a lot of people since this book came out who are not just cartoonists, but various people who are obligated to occasionally show up and get up in front of a crowd, whether they're musicians or authors or whatever. And a lot of what I heard from people is just that you're never safe. Like you could have a best-selling novel or something, and you could have 10 incredible standing room only events, and for whatever reason, one city you get to and there's just no one there. It's always a roll of the dice till the day you die, I think.
Is there a way to kind of deal with that and have it not be completely demoralizing? I mean, at the very least, like you must know that if tonight in Columbus was bad, then maybe tomorrow in Cincinnati will be better.
Yeah, I think maybe that's the mark of a true pro. Like I've heard stories of people showing up and there's just like a small smattering of people, and instead of awkwardly proceeding, they gather up and go to a bar together or something like that. Or you just sort of get through it and just move on to the next one. But for me, it's very difficult. Like I've tried to describe it like it's funny that I've done this book now kind of depicting a lot of these events, because when I was living through those events, I actually felt as if someone was watching me and observing it, almost kind of like a Truman Show kind of thing. And so it wasn't just the pain of walking in and seeing a sparsely attended room, but it was almost as if there was some audience who was at a remove watching that happen to me and taking pity on me or something like that.
In the early days, at least, when you experience something like that, it must feel like, you're paying your dues. And I suspect that, you have a couple books out and the aggregate of things over time start to look a little bit better. This is actually a conversation I have a lot with a lot of indie musicians, where they get to a certain point in their career and they're just like, I don't know if my audience is just getting older and they've got kids and they don't want to come out. I don't know if people just aren't going to indie shows anymore, and really sort of trying to divorce the personal experience from these larger issues of, of people maybe just not coming out to bookstores.
Yeah. And I mean, it's true. I think I'm of a generation of creative people, musicians, writers who, you hope your audience ages with you to a degree. You hope to find some new readers or new audience members, but it's nice if you have this core group that ages with you. And as an audience member myself, I know I just go out a lot less, and I just don't enjoy standing up in rock clubs for 4 hours anymore. And so I'm part of the problem too. I attend things a lot less than I used to.
Did you just have a working list of these stories, of these grudges that you had over time?
Yeah, all mental. Like I didn't literally have a list. I'm not that crazy that I have like a dry erase board with with all my grudges written on it or something.
The strings of yarn on the wall.
Yeah. I vaguely knew that I had an accumulation of these ideas in my mind, but I didn't have them written down on paper or anything. And I just started at the beginning with the book and just started kind of going from story to story, and just I'd say like, let's see what happened. What happened in like 1994? Oh yeah, and then something would come to mind, and I would just.
You're able to sort of pinpoint it to that degree?
In that I can put my books and comics out in front of me and see the publication date on it, and then that reminds me of the promotion that was related to it.
So like when I was on tour for this specific book, these are the stories that happened.
Yeah, that's right.
When you were going through these and you know, again, especially in the early days when you did have a sense of kind of paying your dues, was there this notion of one day I'm going to be able to tell these stories, you know, one day these will be fodder for a good book?
It hadn't occurred to me until being a cartoonist kind of became sort of my identity to my friends and family. And then what happened was anytime something bad would happen to me, someone, often a family member or a friend, would say like, well, it's all good material. And that was like their attempt at consoling me. And usually it pissed me off. But in the back of my mind, I think I was sort of taking note. Like there's a lot of things like that where someone will give me a criticism and I'm just, you know, seething with rage about it. But then at the same time, I'm like, well, maybe that's sort of similar to a criticism that another person gave me, and maybe they're both onto something. So I have that reaction a lot. And I think with this like, it'll be good material someday, it gave me the idea. And also I sort of felt like almost obligated to make it so, like, because that has been said to me so often, and I had so many of these experiences. And I at a certain point, I really did feel like I think that there is a way, as corny as it sounds, to sort of turn all that pain into something a little more positive. You know, when I look back on my life, I now think of it more in terms of this book than actually living through those experiences.
The moment when your identity changed, when you really just considered yourself a cartoonist, is that something that you can pinpoint?
You know, I think at least with my family, it started way before I was publishing work. I think just because it was such a consuming hobby of mine. And I think that was just sort of my identity, even as a kid. As I got older, like I definitely wasn't like known as a cartoonist among my peers when I was in high school or college, because I kept it very private. So it was sort of like I had that identity when I was young, and it was given to me by my friends and family when I was a kid. And then it sort of kind of went into hibernation, even though I was doing more work that's more connected to what I do now. But I was just a lot more private about it. And it was such a different time. I mean, probably now, if I was in high school, I would be telling everyone, oh, I'm putting out these mini comics and I'm doing comic strips for Tower Records magazine and all these things that probably would be regarded in a different light now. But in late 80s, early 90s, I just felt like, I'm not gonna tell anybody about this. I don't want to open myself up to anything more.
The difference being kind of the cultural perception of comics?
I think so. Just the cultural perception of comics and what it means to be like a quote unquote nerd, or what it means to be creative. I mean, you know, it has to do with time passing, and also it's probably a little more specific to where I was. Like I was going to high school in the suburbs of Sacramento, and I have friends who at the same time were going to high school in Berkeley, and they had a totally different experience.
I'm sure we've talked about this before, but I was in Fremont, and even in Fremont, because it was still kind of, I mean, the internet was around, but like there was still all of this stuff that just didn't seem to exist in the suburbs in the same way. Yeah. No, I kind of was, I think, who knows what my high school in Sacramento is like now, but I really felt like at the time that I was trapped, the horrible stereotype of, you know, what is cool, what's uncool, how to rise and be liked, and how to get beaten up, and the things that just seem so
stereotypical now. And I'm sure that that wasn't really the case in other parts of the country at that time.
What was your sense of comics culture when you were in high school?
I felt like I was one of those guys that you see on the beach with like a metal detector, kind of like looking for something underneath the sand. I didn't have like a group of friends who were into comics or were making comics. I didn't have any teachers who took me under their wing or anything like that. So it was very, very isolated. And it was really like me going into a comic shop and taking stabs in the dark and being like, I wonder what neat stuff is. That sounds interesting. And just like grabbing things. And really doing the best I could in the pre-internet world of connecting with people and finding things. And so I would see a mention of a mini comic in a published comic like Yummy Fur or something like that. And so I would send off money to an address, and then I would get a mini comic in the mail, and I'd strike up a correspondence. Traveling was really useful. Like if my family went on a trip and I got to go to a different comic book store, like I don't think people really have that experience anymore just because you can buy everything from your bedroom now. But the idea of like going to a comic shop in San Francisco, suddenly there was all this stuff that I hadn't seen before in Sacramento, or definitely like going to New York and then going to Jim Hanley's Universe or something. I was like, what is all this stuff? I've never seen any of these things before. And so it was really, just me kind of in the dark, bumbling around and buying a lot of crap, buying a lot of stuff that I really regretted and that I didn't even like. But that's how you find the occasional gem.
I mean, you mentioned Peter Bagg and Chester Brown. So, I mean, you had these glints. You had this idea that there was a world of this stuff out there that maybe you weren't completely alone in that.
Yeah. And that really opened up with the discovery of mini comics. I was constantly sending money off to someone and checking the mail to see if something was arriving. And when I started making my own mini comics, it really was kind of like a little analog kind of network. It was like kind of almost like the primitive version of social media or something like that. But I spent a lot of time corresponding and exchanging zines and things like that with, not just cartoonists, but zine people too. And I ended up meeting a lot of those people and becoming friends with them too.
I'm going to paraphrase here, but I think you sort of describe in hindsight that your comics at the time as being like sad emo comics.
Yeah.
That's something that now that you're kind of trying to work against. I mean, do you feel like because you had such a specific style and voice that you kind of painted yourself into the corner?
I was headed in that direction for sure. I was definitely at a certain point kind of paralyzed by trying to figure out what people liked about my work. I was confused about it, and I wanted to focus in on that, but I didn't know what it was. And I think I, for a while, was fixated more on the superficial things, like what the characters looked like, or how the comics were designed, or things like that. And it did start to feel like a bit of a trap. I mean, I'd say starting with shortcomings, every book I've done has been some sort of attempt to kind of do something differently, to shake things up a little bit, at least within my parameters from what I did before. But everything I did prior to that was kind of me kind of just going in a straight line, like, okay, the stories in Sleepwalk were okay, so let me just do a few more of those and I'll package that up as Summer Blonde. And I wasn't really consciously thinking about things in terms of books, and I wasn't thinking about progression at all. I was just thinking of like, I think it was more like, it was sort of my training ground. And really I had to, maybe it was necessary. I was focused completely on trying to attain competency and just to effectively execute something, rather than to be able to take one step back and say, okay, let me look at it in terms of not just competency, but style and tone and try and evolve.
We talk a lot about how we're happy that Facebook or Twitter didn't exist when we were younger, because that when we were like 13 or 15, we didn't have this venue just to put all of our ideas out of the world. But you were pretty young when you were making some of these comics. I mean, you were like a late teenager for a lot of this, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, not a lot of people have seen it, but there are actually published, semi-published comics that I did when I was probably about 14. I got hooked up with a child safety organization in Sacramento, and they commissioned me to do educational comics about safety. And I did 2 issues of that actually were printed in huge quantities because they were distributed through the public school system. And then, there's things that I did starting when I was probably 15 or 16 that are still today in print from Drawn and Quarterly, unfortunately.
Is that sort of stuff hard for you to look at this point?
Oh yeah, I never look at it. I mean, I haven't even read the new book since it came out in book form.
You don't think there's a value in kind of going back and seeing where you were and how you've evolved?
There probably is. It doesn't mean
I don't want to take advantage of it.
Doesn't mean I do it. Yeah. I think I kind of get the same effect by just thinking back on it mentally and cringing and being like, okay, yeah, I want to do something that's not quite like that, or I want to do something better than that. I think the danger is that I might be egotistical enough that I could go back and look at something and be like, oh, I kind of like that or something, and then just not feel this. I'm more compelled to progress and evolve by not looking at the work for whatever reason.
Were you purposely shying away from autobio or memoir? I mean, obviously, like that's a huge on-ramp for so many cartoonists.
Well, I did a little bit of it when I first started out, but it was more like an exercise. It was sort of like I read the great autobiographical stuff by people like Chester Brown and Justin Green, who was I was actually neighbors when I was a teenager. I was neighbors with Carol Tyler and Justin Green. And I read that kind of work and I thought, oh, there's no way I'm going to put myself out there like that. I'm not going to expose myself. I don't even want to investigate it on my own. I don't want to look into myself with that kind of scrutiny. And so I did they were autobiographical in that they featured me as a character, but they were so uninsightful and so unrevealing that they might as well have just been a fictional character. I think I just at some point got locked into this way of thinking of myself as a fiction writer, as a fictional comic creator. And I felt like for someone with my temperament, it was maybe the best way to actually express myself and investigate my thoughts and fears and anxieties was through fictional stories. And I think I pushed that as far as I've gone so far with the book Killing and Dying. And so when I finished that book, I was totally ready to just keep working in that vein. I was like, I've got 3 more stories just like this ready to go. And then I thought, well, no one's going to be lining up for that right now. And I don't really feel like doing that work. It just didn't appeal to me, even though it seemed like it would be easy. It didn't appeal to me.
Did well, right? What do you mean people wouldn't be excited to line up for it?
I guess that's just, I just have maybe it's a paranoia, but I have this sense of my, my limited appeal, what I do. I'm not like, I think of some, you think of like certain bands who can hop from genre, like a favorite of mine is Yo La Tengo. They've done every type of music.
They put an ambient record out this year.
Exactly. And they can put out a folk album and a noise rock, and so they're sort of like a full service band. Like if you're a fan of theirs, each record's a surprise, and even within an album, there's different things to interest you. And then there's bands like the Ramones or something like that are kind of more monochromatic. And I just have this sense that, I haven't built a career that is like where I'm jumping from genre to genre or anything like that. And so I'm very sensitive to just within my parameters of not wearing out my welcome. Like I think it's to my benefit that I don't have a book coming out every single year. I'm not extremely prolific. So by the time a new book comes out, people have maybe regained a little bit more interest in me, and so, yeah, I Killing and Dying did well, and it was nicely reviewed, but I just had this feeling that for me and for the readers, it would feel a little bit of that feeling of more of the same, and that's something that I'm kind of afraid of offering as an artist.
So you don't necessarily consider yourself as somebody who jumps from genre to genre, but you made a very concerted effort to do that here.
Yeah.
If the Ramones released a disco album, you weren't afraid of alienating the people who followed you for a very specific, or had a very specific idea of what you bring to the table as a cartoonist.
I had that thought. I had the feeling like that Killing and Dying, I think, was the book of mine that reached the widest audience. And I think that there were people who maybe weren't necessarily comics readers who read a review and picked it up and sort of judged it in terms of contemporary short fiction that they read in prose form or something like that. And I had this sense that not all of them would follow me with this book, and that this might be kind of a niche book for comics fans or other cartoonists or something like that. That was fine to me. Like the decisions I make are not necessarily about what's going to get me the biggest audience or what's going to bring in the biggest sales, but more just in terms of what will keep me engaged and what will be interesting to someone who might be like a long-term fan who's following me from book to book.
Do you feel like you are less hung up on those notions of success and mainstream appeal than you would have been, 10, 15 years ago?
Definitely. Yeah. I was, when I was doing the early issues of Optic Nerve, I was working completely in response to the industry that I was mired in. Like I was really thinking of my competition as like Image Comics and things like that. You
were competing against Spawn with Optic Nerve.
Yeah, like literally because there was no differentiation. I mean, like I would be placed alphabetically between whatever those titles were on the rack, and I just had to sort of like hope that someone would choose mine over the others. And also I really had it's kind of embarrassing to talk about, but I was very ambitious, and I really had dreams of having a different kind of audience. And to me, it was like a great fantasy to like have my work published in book form and actually maybe do a signing in a bookstore instead of a comic book store, to say nothing of, working for the New Yorker or something like that.
Why is that embarrassing?
Well, because I don't know if it's embarrassing, but, it's the storyline of my career is more palatable to people if it's like, and then this thing dropped in his lap, and then this strange turn of events happened, and someone asked him to do this, as opposed to me like hungrily like clawing my way up and like trying to get things.
You don't want to look back in your career and think of it as a series of lucky breaks. I mean, you do want to think that you worked towards a goal and you earned it.
Yeah, it's I don't know. It's hard for my personality. It's like, I'm very hypocritical in that way, that I can be very judgmental if I see a cartoonist who I think is like very concerned with their career and self-promotion and they're trying to really climb in various ways. And then at the same time, I look at my career and I can point to all the times that I did just that, but maybe just with a veneer of humility or something like that.
And you literally just released a book that's like about, to some degree, about those things. It's to some degree sort of like about the hustle and about really just every kind of embarrassing moment along the way.
Yeah, I was forcing myself to kind of look at myself in a way that wasn't flattering to me, that wasn't comfortable. My main criteria in picking the material for this book, first of all, was it funny? At least the first section of the book is it funny, and will it relate? Will people understand it? But also in concert with that, I was really forcing myself to go into areas that by my standards were uncomfortable. Again, this is not Justin Green material. This is not Chester Brown material, but in its own way, I was delving into stuff that was hard for me to depict in some ways.
Do you get the sense that this is the beginning of something larger for you, or does this just really kind of feel like a possibly one-off in your career?
Well, it won't be, the next book is not going to be a continuation of it. I'll say that. But I really enjoyed making this book probably more than any any book I've made since I was a teenager. I don't know how I'll judge the relative worth of the result down the line, but just in terms of the process of creating it, this was an experience that I actually enjoyed and I didn't feel tortured by. And you know, my wife is a good barometer, and she was really noting that I was enjoying the process more than usual, and I was in a better mood at the end of the day. And I was, and a lot of it has to do with the speed that I created the pages. It can be very, very mentally and emotionally taxing to work in the mode that I have in the past, where it takes me like a week to complete a page. It just feels like, you know, your real life around you is moving at a breakneck pace, and you're just barely inching along at the drawing board. And with this book, because I allowed myself to loosen up and work in a different style, I was at my best point getting a page a day done, which felt great to me. I
get the sense, though, that you were almost maybe preemptively apologetic for the fact that it looked a little bit looser. I mean, just the packaging, the fact that it, you know, looks like a notebook is kind of a not so subtle wink to the audience to tell them, yeah, this is maybe going to be a little bit looser and a little bit more sketchy 100%. Than what I usually do.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. And that's why I fought so hard for that extremely difficult and expensive production on it, because like you said, I didn't want a single person to flip open the book and go, oh my God, you know,
what happened to Adrian?
What happened? Yeah.
He's losing it. Yeah.
This isn't the guy who does New Yorker covers.
You don't want people to think you're phoning it in.
Which often happens with cartoonists as they get older. So yeah, I wanted,
and just creative people in general.
True. And so I wanted, you're right. The book design, in addition to trying to make something that would be interesting and encourage people to buy the real book, it was, like you said, kind of a signal from from the starting point that it was intentional, that the drawing style was done to look like a sketchbook.
I was watching the interview that you did with Seth recently, and it was great from the standpoint of, I think the thing that he really brought to the table, and this is as clear in his work as anyone else's, that maybe he was somebody who had sort of set up his art based on I don't know if arbitrary is the right way to describe it, but a very sort of stringent set of rules. And it wasn't until later in his career that he was really able to kind of to loosen up. Mm-hmm. Do you feel that way about your own work, that maybe, you know, because you came up at a certain time and because you had a certain set of tools at your disposal, that maybe you were setting kind of almost arbitrary parameters for yourself?
Yeah, I felt very limited and sort of hemmed in by what I thought were the rules and the proper tools and the proper way of doing everything. And to me, letting go of that and almost intentionally breaking those rules has been kind of a transformative experience for me in recent years. Mainly, I would say it started happening with Killing and Dying, and definitely with this book. And yeah, I definitely recommend it for cartoonists who are trying to do what I do and have like a long running career where you go through phases and do different types of books and things like that. But to just really break out of that prison of the proper tools, the proper method, the proper paper, all that stuff.
It's clear how that manifests itself in this book, but I think it's harder. Granted, I haven't read it in a couple of years, but it's hardest to sort of see that in Killing and Dying. Can you point to what the change was for that book?
Yeah, a lot of that book was drawn, I think, because a lot of it is in color, and I colored it in the same way that I often color my illustrations. It seemed more consistent. But you know, prior to that book, everything I did, I would pencil it out on expensive Bristol board, and then I would ink it with a fancy brush and these kind of nibs that you have to dip in ink, and some drafting pens. And then with Killing and Dying, I really, as much as possible, put those tools in a drawer and went to the local stationery store and grabbed things and tried to work with them. And so like the story that's called Go Owls was done with felt tip markers, which, you know, always seemed like a no-no. But I was happy with the way it came out. And then the story that I think got the strongest response in the whole book, which is the title story, the whole thing is drawn with just a mechanical pencil. There's no ink in it at all, except for the lettering. But all the artwork is just, each panel was drawn on a sheet of typing paper with just a regular number 2 mechanical pencil, and that's it.
This is probably the case with a lot of different creative pursuits, but I've definitely noticed in comics that the people who really spend the most time on a page are the ones who tend to be jealous of those cartoonists to whom things just sort of like come naturally.
Yeah. Well, that I was that guy for many years. I was, drawing on giant pieces of board with my fancy brush and everything, taking a week to do a page. And then I started looking at people like John Porcellino or Jeffrey Brown, even Gabrielle Bell, who wasn't quite as loose as those guys, but
she has her sketchbook though. I mean, she does some pretty quick stuff too.
Yeah, exactly. And I just was so envious. I was like, how are these guys? How do they get away with it? It's like they're cheating, and yet I enjoy reading the books. So what difference does it make? You know, it was. So I was. But I think at the time I was feeling that at its strongest, I was like halfway through the book Shortcomings, and so I was like, oh God, I've got 2 more years of this shit.
you can't just like stop midstream. You can't just like, people will be like, wait a second, after page 50, the drawing just isn't as good. Adrian is just totally checked out from the end of this book.
Yeah, that's 100% why I never have and probably never will do one of these massive 20-year graphic novel projects. I just I wouldn't be able to maintain that consistency without losing my mind.
How is the process actually different for you? I mean, is it just a matter of telling yourself that I'm done with this, it's time to move on? Yeah,
I mean, you sort of set the parameters and the rules of what you're doing for each specific project. And so like with the new book, I just did a bunch of sample pages leading up to actually doing the work, and I found a nice small size to work at and a cheap kind of paper that I didn't care if I ripped it up and threw it away, instead of having to do a million paste-ons and whiteouts and all that kind of stuff. And I chose one pen to use for the whole thing, and just kept reminding myself, like, the goal is to do a page a day. And I didn't always land there, but if you have that in your mind, it's kind of like the clock is ticking. And I just was trying to tap into that tradition that the original cartoonists, like the newspaper cartoonists, had, which is you got your deadline and it's just got to be good enough. You know, I think a lot of us of my generation had this luxury of no deadlines, no editors, and the perfectionism can really overtake you. And so I was really trying to get back into thinking of this as the sort of cheap commercial art form that it started out as, like get something done every day and make sure it's good enough and hope it's, decent. And if it's not, then you have the next day.
I think this speaks to you as a person, and I can only say it's because I think this also speaks to me as a person, but that in order, there's an irony that in order to kind of loosen the parameters, you have to basically set a new set of parameters, right? Yeah. In order to get looser with your work, you have to like set an arbitrary deadline for yourself.
Yeah. And also, I was unlike pretty much any other book I've done, this was one that was really conceived of as a book, as a complete thing. And I had a vision of what it would look like from the start. And so I didn't want to feel like, oh, okay, midway through, I'm going to start doing it as a watercolor painting or something like that.
You had an idea of the product as a book, but it does seem like the storytelling or the content or the format kind of evolved over time.
Yeah, except I didn't work in a vacuum and just start drawing the first page and then the next page. It really, the way I describe, or at least I hint at how the book was created at the end of the book is very much true. I kind of saw the whole thing at once. I knew where I wanted to end up, and I knew how the lead up to it would relate to that. And so it was, it wasn't written out, but it was completely planned out in my mind. And that's why I did not want to let advanced pages of it get out. And I didn't want people to start seeing previews of it, because I really wanted someone to have the book in their hands, and I wanted them to read the whole story, because I thought there's kind of like two parts of this, and both felt incomplete. Like the first part feels very, very light and jokey, and the last part feels kind of just, more heavy and emotional. And I thought they really needed to be together.
And you didn't tell D&Q that you were working on it in the beginning?
Yeah, I finished Killing and Dying and just kind of went off the grid with them for a while. And normally we very quickly, in the past, what would happen was, while I was on tour for a book, when I came to Montreal to do an event, I would go out to breakfast with Peggy and Tom or Chris when he was running it, and sort of talk about what the next book is and get set up with contracts and an advance and all that stuff. And this one, I just told them, I don't know. I'll be in touch. And I just kind of did other things. And then I just started working on it privately before I even talked to them. And I think I was about halfway done with the book before I even told them that it existed, because I wanted to work with the knowledge that no one was expecting it, that no one had paid for it, that there was no deadline, and that if it started to be really horrible, I could just throw it away and no one would say, what happened to the book you were working on?
Have you gotten that far down the road with something that you just had to trash?
No, I mean, by the time I actually talked to John Quarterly, I knew obviously that I was going to go see it through.
You did not have a ton of faith in this project early on.
I wanted to do it, and I knew that I was going to enjoy it, and I knew that 10 friends of mine were going to get a kick out of it, but I wasn't sure that it was something that John and Quarterly was going to be interested in. That was my main concern, but I didn't want to cater to second guessing what they wanted. I wanted to just make the book that I wanted, and if they were interested, they would have first dibs on it, of course. It
must feel like a luxury to be able to do that. I mean, obviously you've got very pragmatic concerns. You live in New York City.
Yeah.
You've got 2 children. Like you can't just like work on a project and not have it come out.
That's true. And there's a little bit of cockiness to that, because it's sort of, I guess in the back of my mind, I thought like someone will want to put it out. If John Quarterly passes on it, maybe I could find another place for it to exist or something, or I could self-publish it and still sell enough to make it worthwhile or something like that. And definitely by the time I reached out to them, it was largely because I was ready to take a little bit of an advance.
It felt experimental to some degree, but you knew you had something there.
I was enjoying the process. I was happy with the way it was coming out. Those were my main criteria. And then all the other issues were sort of, well, I'll figure it out. If John Quarterly doesn't like it, I'll find some other place for it. Or, if it doesn't sell well, then that's okay. And I can jump onto something else shortly thereafter.
By the end of Killing and Dying, were you not enjoying the experience?
The whole process of creating Killing and Dying was difficult for me, both because the artwork was a lot more meticulous and most of it was in color.
It was varied from story to story.
Yeah. But especially the coloring aspect, which involves a computer. I just don't enjoy that. Like, I don't enjoy spending a whole day clicking on shapes to color a page of comics. Especially like the title story, which had so many little panels per page. But also on top of that, the span of my life that book encompasses involved my wife basically being unemployed so that she could complete her PhD, and the birth of both of our children, and everybody being in a small Brooklyn apartment 24 hours a day. So for a lot of reasons, completing that book was very, very difficult. And I was in no mood to jump back into a similar situation.
What's your relationship to making art right now that everybody is quite literally locked indoors?
It's been tough. I would say that I've gotten a lot less accomplished in the last 5 months than I was hoping to.
I was talking to Bob Skoriak about this last night, and I sort of, the analogy I keep coming back to is that episode of The Twilight Zone where...
Oh, all the time in the world?
Yeah, exactly. Where like everybody disappears and this guy gets super excited about having all the time in the world to read. And I think about that in terms of, cartoonists. They tend to be, obviously this is not the case with him, but they tend to be very solitary. And like you would think that they would get kind of, not that granted anybody wants a situation, but, kind of excited to have all the time in the world to work on comics, but it never works out like that.
Well, and also I did not have all the time in the world because I had 2 kids who were home from school every day. And so that's what made me change things. I think if I was living alone during this time, it would be hard emotionally, but I think I would have been productive. I think I would have, I might be one of those annoying people who now has a brand new book that they started in quarantine. Because that would have been my defense against the loneliness and the anxiety would be to bury myself in work. But as a parent, I really didn't have that as an option. And so I've been able to do some stuff, but I definitely have not had the energy to decide, here's my next big book project, and I'm going to dive into it right now, because I don't trust my judgment right now.
Once you kind of reacquainted yourself with the joy of making comics, do you get a sense that you will be able to continue to tap into that to some degree on future projects?
I think what's totally crucial for me is to work on other things and then feel excited about coming back to comics. I'm trying to do some screenwriting right now, which I'm enjoying, but it also brings its own complications that make me excited about some of the freedom that I have with comics. I don't think I'm going to be able to keep making every book I do like a total switch up and a total departure, but I like being able to at least oscillate between various modes. And so like right now, it appeals to me to do art that's like very different from what I did in the loneliness of Long-Distance Cartoonist, and do stuff that's very illustrative and detailed and colorful. And that sounds really fun to me now. It was not appealing, when I finished Killing and Dying, but now after having worked on this book, that sounds nice to me.
Is the idea of switching things up, is that what keeps bringing you back to things like screenwriting?
Well, screenwriting is unfortunately a thing that has been like a secret hobby and a secret desire of mine since I was a little kid. And in some ways, I wish I didn't have that. And I'm envious of people who are just like completely thrilled with being a cartoonist, and if only they had more time, they would get more comics done, and that's all they want to do.
Obviously, you're friends with Dan. You must see what he does, and he's able to. I mean, he's maybe not doing as much anymore, but he has been able to successfully straddle that line.
Yeah, no, I mean, in many ways, Dan has been like such a role model for me, and that includes how he's toggled between those worlds. I am lucky enough to have been sort of, to a degree, along for the ride through all his movie projects, and even at their worst points or the most frustrating points, I was always very envious of that experience, and I thought, that I could see why that's annoying, but still, you're making a movie, and if I was able to purge myself of that kind of fantasy and that desire to work in that business, I totally would, because I would be a much more focused and satisfied person, because then I could just work on comics all the time. But unfortunately, I've just been a lifelong movie fan and a TV fan, and there's this little part of me that I can't shake.
Are you able though to take a step back and realize how incredibly lucky you have been to be able to make a living doing comics and drawing covers for the New Yorker?
Yes, and that is a point that gets brought up a lot by people who are slightly annoyed with this book, because it seems like, how dare you complain about anything? And of course, yes, and yeah, and I hope that people come away from the book thinking that I'm not whining about the way my career has ended up or the way things have turned out or anything like that, and that the book really is a lot more of an investigation into my weird personality and my sensitivities and my easily wounded ego and things like that. Not so much. I think it's easy for people to describe it as like a series of grudges, or like I'm getting vengeance on people who once
everyone who slighted you in the past.
Yeah. And I really I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel like that if that was my goal, I definitely didn't succeed.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anyone can read a story like the one about talking to the reporter and then having, we've all had bathroom incidents, and I don't think anyone can see that as you taking your grudges out on people. I mean, right. Obviously, like, it was important for you to kind of make yourself the butt of the joke as well.
Yeah, and I hope that people sort of look for that throughout the book, because a lot of attention has been paid to a story where another fairly well-known cartoonist doesn't say my name at an award ceremony, and people think that the point of the story is to like get back at him, but really I find his behavior a little bit confounding, but it's mine, which is much more embarrassing, where in my mind I'm thinking that he and I are going to become friends, and then suddenly I'm literally holding back tears in the middle of an award ceremony because my feelings were so hurt.
Were you able to kind of exercise some of these demons by getting them down on paper?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think time had already done a lot of the work for me. None of them were so painful that I was like traumatized trying to revisit them. But yeah, turning them into comics has actually transformed my memories of the experience to a degree, in that now I really think back on those anecdotes in terms of the comic version of it rather than actually living through it.